Yeah. No, I mean, if you ask Paul McCartney who broke up the Beatles, he said it can't be Yoko because the Beatles were already breaking up. All right, so today we're going to talk about my favorite band, the Beatles.
All right.
You know, probably the most influential band in modern music.
Oh, yeah.
Everything that they did, basically, they took it to the next level. You know, when they were playing and they came to America, there weren't venues that were big enough to hold them. So they had to play at these baseball stadiums.
It's crazy.
And, you know, the PAs, they weren't able to accommodate the size of their crowds. And, you know, that's just a very small point, but they just broke so many boundaries and they just paved the way for so many musicians and so much music.
Oh, yeah. Music today that we don't even know has anything to do with the Beatles. It is definitely inspired by this lineage of Beatles music.
Either directly or indirectly.
Indirectly, for sure.
Yeah. And, you know, it's funny because John Lennon got so much heat for saying this, but that's why he said that, you know, the Beatles were bigger than Jesus.
And he didn't even, mean it in that way, right?
He didn't mean it vainly. He meant it as in, a state of what was going on.
The state of the world. More people are interested in a band rather than in
a religion.
Probably what maybe they should be more interested in, right? He was kind of suggesting that.
Yeah. He wasn't, boasting about the Beatles being so big, and that's how everyone took it. And the UK didn't really care that much that they said it. But when they got to America, the Americans were, super holding that against them.
Mm-hmm. And, of course, it was fueled probably by, the news and the media. Media, of course. And they're still doing it today.
And any time that there's something so great, there's always going to be an equal opposition to it. Mm-hmm. You know, something that the higher you go, the more people want to see you fall. Mm. And that's why, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but people who don't like the Beatles, they have to let you know that, hey, I don't like the Beatles.
Yeah, I don't really like the Beatles, man. They're not my thing.
It's like they identify with rebelling against liking the Beatles.
They don't have an actual reason, a logical explanation why they don't like the Beatles. They're just they want to dislike them because everyone else is liking them.
Right, they'll say something like they're overrated or something. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But all music is subjective anyways, right?
Maybe not when it comes to the Beatles.
Personally, I mean, they've been a huge inspiration on my own musical growth. Mm-hmm. And there's just so much repertoire that they have. And they have, throughout history, their short history, they went from, being this, wannabe R&B group, to, being this serious singer-songwriters, once Bob Dylan introduced them to weed. And then they start, they're moving with the whole 60s. That's another reason why it was so big, is because they're, a reflection of the whole culture at the time. So then they start dabbling into psychedelics, and then they come out with, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and at that time, they'd even stopped touring. And they were making these albums that you couldn't even play live, which is the standard for today.
It's just crazy how, they were so transformational, like you were saying, from their first album to their last album and everything in between, they were constantly changing. They were truly going on this, journey of evolution.
Yeah.
Finding their self and...
Right. Maybe one of the reasons that they were so successful was because they were just so raw. Mm-hmm. They were, okay, I want to be this today. I want to wake up and feel like that today. I want to write a song like this. And there was no constraints, especially by the end of their career. They were all writing completely different songs from each other.
Right.
George Harrison was over here writing something, something in the way she moves. And McCartney's over here, why don't we do it in the road?
Right. It's they broke so many rules. Music school would never tell you to, write music that's so drastically different, even within one album. Yet they were able to do that, and it sounded good.
Right.
And it sounds like them, yet one song to the other can sound completely different.
Not only that, but there's even different singers. So they're keeping this cohesion of, it still sounds like the Beatles. It's the Beatles.
Right.
But it sounds so different than one of their other songs. Strawberry Fields Forever versus I Want to Hold Your Hand. Like, that's not the same band, but it is.
And they got away with it gracefully.
And maybe it was just because they were able to be unapologetically themselves. Okay, we're going through this little psychedelic phase, so that's what they had to put through their music, and they're feeling out the whole culture of the world too.
Right.
And I mean, you can only imagine how stressful that was to be that big.
When there was no infrastructure to be that big.
Right.
That's why they got so taken advantage of. I mean, they had their music taken away from them. Who knows what else that we don't even know about.
Right, yeah. There was no standard industry.
No protection, nothing.
Especially for the volume of success that they had.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be till later that Paul McCartney starts figuring out about publishing and owning rights and things like that.
I can't imagine.
Which he would ultimately tell Michael Jackson, hey, you need to get into publishing. And so what does Michael Jackson do? He goes and buys the Beatles' rights from underneath Paul McCartney.
So Michael Jackson, was he young?
So Michael Jackson, he's this up-and-coming little kid R&B singer. Paul McCartney's fresh out of the Beatles. He's doing Wings and stuff. And so, Paul McCartney's like, I want to work with this new up-and-coming kid. And, of course, Michael Jackson's like, heck yeah, I'll work with a legend, a Beatle. And so they start working together, and Paul McCartney's kind of mentoring Michael Jackson. Hey, the business side, you need to protect your songs, get into music publishing. It's a really good business for musicians. And so Michael Jackson starts joking. He's like, haha, yeah, I'm going to buy your songs one day. And McCartney's like, haha. And McCartney said that Michael Jackson brought it up a couple more times. Like, I'm not playing, And so then there comes a time when the Beatles catalog is up for sale for $10 million, and they don't own the rights, So out of respect to John, he calls up Yoko like, hey, do you want to go in on these rights with me? They're asking 10 mil. Yoko tells him, I think we could get him down to 5.
Oh, gosh. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm part Japanese. That is such an Asian thing to do. Yeah. Or just try to,
try to get that deal.
When they could probably easily, afford it.
Afford the money.
Oh, gosh.
So a young Michael Jackson, hot off of Thriller, comes in and buys it for like 45 mil. Boom, case closed. I got the money.
Oh, gosh.
So Michael Jackson owned the Beatles catalog for a long time, at least some of their songs.
With everything, with like the Michael Jackson, publicity thing with the children, which I lean more to the side that I don't think that he did that to the children. I don't know. Wasn't there. But I do lean more towards the side that he didn't do that. But when I think of that, what he did to Paul McCartney and the Beatles, that's what boils my blood. Like, how could you? And you see videos of McCartney talking about it, and he's such a gentleman. He's so graceful. He's just like, yeah, ha ha ha. He doesn't talk. He doesn't use the opportunity to talk. Go in and into the nitty gritty and really talk bad about Michael Jackson.
Right, and slander his name.
Right. So I'm just happy that. A few years ago, McCartney got the rights back somehow.
I think he's bought some of his songs back. I don't know, the whole who owns every song, but he definitely didn't own a majority of the songs for a majority of his life. There was a long time when he didn't own any of his songs, basically.
Oh, gosh. I just can't imagine that.
Yeah, and that's just how the business was.
Right. What was the story in the first place of how they got their rights taken away from them?
Oh, basically they didn't know. They didn't even know about rights and publishing, so they just signed off.
And then what happened? Like, were they in India or something?
I think what happened was something around like, McCartney's like, hey, I think we need a raise. Like,
raise?
Yeah, like we've been playing, we've been playing for you since we were in Germany, doing the pubs and stuff, and now they're superstars, and he's like, you would think, maybe we'd get a raise, and someone laughed at him and told him that's not how it works.
That's so sad. And then something about I just remember hearing something about they were in India and they get a phone call or something, something about their manager or somebody.
I think the story you're referring to, is something along the lines of, they were like, hey, we're going to use this song for something or something, the label guys, the guys in the suits, and McCartney's like, you can't do that, and he's like, I just did. That's when McCartney realized that he had no rights to his music. But I think you're also mistaking that with the story of them getting the call when they're in India. So while the Beatles are in India writing the White Album, and they're having this great, spiritual vacation, okay, and they're learning yoga and meditation and all this great stuff, they get a call that their manager had killed himself.
What?
Had committed suicide.
Like the one that was with him from the start.
Yeah. The guy who got them big. The guy who believed in them and put it all on the line for them. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, that would be the downfall of the Beatles. Before that, things were going pretty bad for them. Mm-hmm. I think it was about 1966 when they basically stopped playing out live. So John Lennon, he says that stuff, we're more popular than Jesus. Mm-hmm. And then they go on a tour, and, there's KKK outside of their shows in America burning Beatles records and stuff, And then, so that's not going very well. The press is eating them up. And then they make it over to the Philippines, and they accidentally insult the Queen of the Philippines.
How?
And so they were invited to a breakfast, mm-hmm. and they denied. They were busy. And they didn't know that was culturally unacceptable. So all of a sudden, all of the Philippines is in on this thing against them. All of a sudden, their taxi drivers don't know where to go. They can't get a ticket to the UK, back to the UK in their planes, and all this crazy stuff is happening. So I guess, Brian Epstein was still alive, and he somehow makes it work, gets the boys out of there alive. And they're getting death threats and things. And even the shows that they are playing, the speaker system is not able to overpower the crowds. The crowds are so loud that the bands can't even hear themselves. The mm-hmm. Beatles can't hear themselves. So their performances were horrible because they couldn't hear themselves. So it's 1966, they decide to stop touring. Then they come out with, I think, Sgt. Pepper's, and they go through all that. And this is about the same time that Yoko shows up in John Lennon's life.
Oh, so that was pretty late.
Yeah. No, I mean, if you ask Paul McCartney who broke up the Beatles, he said it can't be Yoko because the Beatles were already breaking up, before she was there. Mm. So it was just part of John Lennon's progression, And so he leaves his wife, and he goes to Yoko, and basically, boom, 1968, they're in India having this vacation. The manager kills himself. I think it might have been 67, 68, something like that. And Paul McCartney steps up to be the band leader. But how are you going to be a band leader in the Beatles? You got the biggest rock stars of their time in that day and age. And you're going to try and tell John Lennon what to do?
When to show up for practice.
Yeah.
Right.
And at that time, George Harrison, he already had it. Like, he was so fed up with them. Mm-hmm. Because they didn't let him use any of his songs.
Right. Everyone had, like, their own little thing of why they felt like being in the band wasn't fair to them.
It wasn't allowing them to grow anymore.
Right.
They all felt that the band was giving them limitations for their own personal growth. Mm-hmm. But I think McCartney felt that the band was the only way to actually get to that next level of personal growth. Like, no, it's here. We need to reconnect,
Right.
So John Lennon's, like, doing his thing with Yoko Ono, Mm-hmm. And they're, like, doing their whole crazy hippie stuff. And they're being peace activists and stuff. And Paul McCartney, he really just kind of wants to do the Beatles. Mm-hmm. And George Harrison, he starts hanging out with guys like Keith Richards and Bob Dylan and all these really famous songwriters. And they're all giving him respect. And they're writing with George Harrison. And so this gives George a new sense of confidence.
Right.
When Bob Dylan's telling you that's a good song, you don't need affirmation from John Lennon,
Right. No more being like the third wheel in the band.
Right. And so they're still not letting George Harrison put the input of all his songs, So then once the Beatles finally did break up, it allowed George Harrison to release this huge volume of work, mm-hmm. Double LP, All Things Must Pass.
Which is a beautiful album, by the way.
Yeah, it's an insane album. It represents who he was in that time. Mm-hmm. Perfect timestamp, Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's crazy because they were all so human.
I know.
They all had their downfalls. They all had their larger than life personas. Mm-hmm. Their rock god personas. So as well as their human weaknesses. Mm-hmm. And so we hear, some of these things like, John Lennon beat his wife. In this day and age, they'd cancel him. Mm-hmm. But before that, I think people were able to actually relate to him in a human way. Like, okay, he's a human being. He's got a dark side. I got a dark side. That's why we relate to musicians. And then we hear their pain and their sorrow and their joys within their songs. And that's why we feel like we can connect with them. Does he get a pass? No, but he's not trying to be a politician or a religious leader. That's why we get hurt when we find out that these, some religious leader did some horrible things to some children.
Right. I mean, he even said it in his song, like, him being that person in his past relationship. So it's not like he was trying to pretend like he was somebody he wasn't. He recognized his flaws, and he was growing. He grew into the person to be that spokesperson for peace. Right.
And he said that one of the reasons that, they were such big advocates on peace was because his dark side, he had a violent side to him.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Aww. So, when he was younger, he didn't know how to control his anger. He was an orphan and such. And there was even a time
he was an orphan?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he lived with his aunt.
Oh, my gosh.
And it's funny because a little unknown fact that a lot of people don't know is that, okay, John Lennon hit his wife once. That's what he admitted to. But Ringo Starr once beat his wife so bad that she almost died.
No way.
Yeah.
Ringo.
Peaceful, lovable Ringo.
Little Ringo.
And, it's like...
Was that before they got big or after?
I think it was after. I think, he was dealing with a lot because, you can only imagine when you're a rock star, no one's going to tell you no. Excess of drugs, you're not happy, and
very out of touch.
Super out of touch.
And lots of pressure.
Tons of pressure. Stressed out, And probably just a ton of drugs and alcohol.
Yeah, I've never even heard of that. So it got no publicity?
I mean, I found it somewhere, you know, but everybody knows that, like, John Lennon beat his wife. Like, what's that? How's it go? It's in Fixing a Hole. And he writes that line, you know, I used to be cruel to my woman. I used to beat her and keep her away from the things that she loved.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, I mean, that's human growth, is when you know, err, you admit it, and you become a new person.
Right,
all right, I'm not going to do that, you know.
Yeah, going back to their transformation, there was so much growth in their short career.
By the time the Beatles broke up, none of them were even 30 years old.
What?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. They seemed so mature and old for...
Yeah, I mean, John Lennon, you know, on that rooftop concert, he looks like he's older than me.
Oh my gosh, he wasn't even barely...
He's probably 28, 29, something like that.
They were babies. But old souls.
Super old souls.
Old souls. My goodness. I can't imagine going through that.
Yeah.
As a baby.
So the Beatles are basically not even a band, but they're going to get together and do one more album. So they get together and they come out with Abbey Road. And it's a pain to make. Everyone's doing their own thing. You know, Beatles are quitting in the middle of it and rejoining. And that's kind of it. And they put out Abbey Road. It's a great album. But then they say, you know what? We don't think that we did it right. So then they take these other collection of songs that they had, finish them, add some more, and they put out Let It Be. And that's the official, real last album.
Wow.
And then they perform on the rooftop, and the 60s are over. Then, you know, 1970, Jimi Hendrix dies. Now, John Lennon's doing his own thing, McCartney's doing his own thing, George Harrison's doing his own thing, so is Ringo. And then in comes the 70s, this whole new era.
And so much of that era was inspired by them. When you hear all these different bands that became very successful, and you can hear little melodies and harmonies and progressions that come straight from the Beatles.
Right.
And it's beautiful. You can't even knock those people for it, because the Beatles were so genius and influential. Like, of course.
Yeah. Absolutely. And the 70s were a whole different ballgame for music, you know, and it brought in a lot of the foundation that the Beatles laid down in the 60s. You know, the industry was able to really build upon in the 70s. Now you're coming out with, you know, double diamond records, and just because the infrastructure is there now to get those records out, because there's a demand, you know. And then, as we all know, sadly, John Lennon will get murdered. I think it was 82 or something. Someone will correct me on that. But
and how did he get murdered? Like,
so he gets murdered outside of his hotel in New York, coming home from a recording session. And I met the engineer, producer, who was actually recording him that day.
No way.
So he's like one of the last people to talk to John Lennon.
What's his name?
Jack Douglas.
Oh my gosh.
And John Lennon put this guy basically on the record. He put Jack Douglas out there. His career would not be what it is without John Lennon.
Right. And so he gets murdered by, like,
some crazy random guy.
Crazy guy.
And I mean, there's conspiracies, all types of conspiracies, you know. But there's one thing for sure, is that the FBI was watching John Lennon, you know, because they knew he had power and he was doing all that activist stuff.
Right. He was heavily against the war.
I think at one point he might have even been, like, deported. Like, I think they took away his citizenship, his
green card.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think at one point they may have.
Right, because, I mean, in a time when an industry as huge as the military industry needs people to be gung-ho about going to war, here's this guy who is
messing up their plans.
Bigger than life, yeah. Convincing people, hey, let's go to the next concert, screw this war. Like, that is not good.
Yeah. And I think the voice that he fulfilled in that area is missing today. You know, no one's saying, no big musicians are saying, hey, you know, think twice about what you're seeing on the news.
Wow. Yeah, good point.
Most of them are just either political for one side or the other side, which automatically kind of makes them just a tool of the government.
100%. They're still distracted in some
Right.
kind of way, fighting each other.
Right.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way, because for us, we're kind of still thinking that the Beatles are current, you know, Jimi Hendrix, all these bands, some of them aren't even alive, but because we grew up listening to that, it's very much alive. That culture is alive in us. But these younger generations, I mean, I've met kids who don't even know who the Beatles are. Like, who's that? John Lennon, who's that? Literally. And you're right. They don't have somebody as big as they were saying, you know, advocating for the things that they were advocating for. Right. Peace and love and coming together. Not even talking about politics. Like, what a statement. Let's not even talk about that. Let's talk about love. Let's talk about peace. You're right. They don't have somebody like that. For us, it's like, oh, yeah, that exists, but not for the next generation.
Right. They need someone who can speak to them. I mean, we can only do our best. All we can do is put out music that comes from our soul and that we think that other people would like, you know? And that's just doing your part. Just everyone's got to do their part. Whatever you can do to make the world better.
Yeah.
All we are saying is give peace a chance. Simple, beautiful.
Oh, you're making me emotional.
All right, we're gonna give it a chance, John.
And so, how about George Harrison? He's still alive.
So at that time, George Harrison's still alive, and you know he's heavy in the Hare Krishna movement, and he actually starts getting into filmmaking.
Film?
Yeah,
like movies. Or movies?
Yeah.
That's so crazy.
And he does a movie, and it tanks, and he basically loses a bunch of money.
Aww.
Yeah. And there's rumors that, you know, him and her hooked up or whatever, and then had a falling out. You know. And so then he's still putting out albums, you know. He did some activist stuff too. And then one day, when he's at his estate, it's got to be the 90s or something, an intruder breaks into their house.
What?
Yeah. And I think this guy's not just a burglar, but I think he's crazy. And he stabs George Harrison. Something like 7 times.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and George is like trying to get him off, and, you know, he's trying to pray for God and stuff. And George Harrison would have been toast if it wasn't for his wife. So she comes in with a lamp and hits the burglar and knocks him out, takes him out.
George Harrison's like praying and nothing's working, but the good old lady comes over with the lamp.
The real angel arrives.
Oh man, I can't believe that. He got stabbed 7 times.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And I mean, this was just another like crazy guy like that killed John Lennon, you know, like.
Where are these crazy people coming from?
It's actually kind of weird that it didn't happen sooner to them when they were actually kids in their 20s and they're blowing up and they were a lot more accessible. So
Right.
it was almost like, you know, like they always had this karma, this shadow, like that happened to them in the Philippines and whatnot, you know, and dealing with these crazy people and dealing with Charles Manson.
Charles Manson?
Charles Manson thought that the White Album by the Beatles had subliminal messages in it
What?
to start a race war.
Oh my gosh. So all that crazy stuff.
Exactly. Those prompted the murders because he thought that the White Album was starting a race war between the blacks and the whites.
That's crazy.
So this is the type of stuff that the Beatles had to deal with.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, that's the influence that this band had. Out of their control.
Out of their control.
Completely out of their control.
Right.
You know? And someone's going to take it the wrong way. Someone's always going to twist your words. So George Harrison survives. Paul McCartney's doing Wings and doing all types of stuff, and he's living his life. Ringo's living his life. And then unfortunately, George Harrison gets cancer and he passes away.
I remember I was like really young when I saw the newspaper.
Yeah. And to this day, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr are still playing.
Legend, living legends. It's crazy to think that they are still alive.
Right.
To me, that's mind blowing. Like sometimes I forget, and I'm like, wait, no, these people are still alive right now. Like you could technically go and see them somehow, some way. Like they're still playing concerts. It's amazing.
Yeah. McCartney's not going to stop till he drops.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah,
And neither is Ringo.
yeah. What crazy people and crazy lives to live.
Crazy karma.
I can't think of another person alive today that has more influence on the world, who are still alive. They created it, they lived through it, and they're still alive today.
Right.
Can you think of somebody?
No, I mean, Michael Jackson was pretty influential, but he's dead.
He's dead.
And he had that dark, you know, shadow over him, too.
Crazy.
It is.
Music is powerful.
It is.